exam with RJ Smith. Do you prefer RJ or
RJ's great. Or
Richard?
Richard's
Cool.
a bit more casual, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think RJ sounds, it's like got street cred, you know. Okay, RJ Smith, he's an Australian writer who currently resides in Paris. He grew up in Sydney and has lived in London and Rio de Janeiro. In addition to his writing, he teaches legal English and English law at a few universities in Paris, and he's published 6 articles in Quillette, which is quite incredible. And his first foray into long-form fiction was with the City Limit trilogy, 3 books that were released around this time last year. So you've done a lot. RJ, how did a guy from Sydney end up in Paris teaching at the Sorbonne?
Yeah, it's a bit of a circuitous route, but basically I did a master's in the UK, and I met a French girl there. And after a few years in London, I was a little bit sick of it, and she moved back to Paris, and so I followed her. Unfortunately, we've since broke up, and
I've been there.
you know,
European love.
that's it.
Yeah.
But I'm still very happy here. I live with my fiance here in Paris, and I've been here for 6 years now. So
Wow, okay.
yeah, but that's how I ended up here.
Cool. What part of Paris are you in? Are you right in the
I'm
centre?
right in the center. Yeah, most of the time I've been living sort of on the outskirts in Paris, but now I'm really central. Just out my window here, I can see the St. Paul's Cathedral. So in a really nice neighborhood.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And what masters were you doing in London?
I did a Master of Laws, focusing on commercial and criminal law, and that's
Okay.
been my focus in teaching. I teach normally criminal, corporate, and corporate criminal law.
Wow. Okay. And in Paris, just before we started recording, you were telling me that you teach legal English for French students who are passing the bar.
Yeah, so this week and last week we're doing the entrance exams for the Paris bar, and they have to do a language component, which they very much resent. But yes, I try to be as delicate with them as I can, because it's not their top priority. But yeah, they have to pass an English oral exam, so I'm doing that this week.
Nice. I taught a bit of English in Spain,
Okay.
but mostly to children and to some adults, but they were engineers and they just did it for fun, you know, to help with work, but
Right.
not to pass the bar. So how did you get into writing as well, and how do you have time for writing?
Well, it sounds like a lot, but to be honest, I do teach. I teach at Nantes University and the Sorbonne, but it's only sort of a few classes per semester. Semester's only half the year, so actually, in the end, I have a lot more time than all my friends who have, full-time jobs. I sort of string together a few different things, so but it actually leaves time to do what I'm most interested in, which is writing.
Cool. And yeah, the reason I really wanted to interview you was because I think you're the first writer who's written for us about Houellebecq, who I love. And I was asking our editors for a while, I was like, oh, we should publish something on Houellebecq. He's so interesting. And finally we did. And your article, The Sorrow and the Self-Pity, was published on the 26th of June. And it's actually fairly critical of Houellebecq and his new memoir, which I haven't yet read, unfortunately. But yeah, how long have you been reading Houellebecq for?
I'm relatively new to Houellebecq. He's been writing for more than about 30 years now, I think, since about the mid-90s. Yeah, I only got into him around 2018. So I was already living in France, and so obviously, you get interested in local writers. So I just started reading him in about 2018, but when I picked up his first book, I just inhaled basically everything.
What was the first book you
think
picked up?
the first one was Atomized, the 1998 book, for which I think he's probably most famous. It's probably his most famous book with Submission. But I absolutely loved Houellebecq immediately. And I was actually in Australia at the time, strangely enough. I think it was to get a visa. And I was texting my French ex saying, this guy's amazing." She didn't feel the same. A lot of French people don't actually love Houellebecq, as in,
So I've
yeah,
heard.
as outside of France. He's got his, I think he's one of those people who people love or hate. But
Exactly.
yeah, for my part, I'm a big fan.
So for people who don't know about Michel Houellebecq, how would you describe him?
Yeah, he's a strange character. In fact, there's even controversy about the year he was born. Some say it was, I think, yeah,
Wow.
some say it's 56, some say it's 58. So even that, so
The mystery.
he's a mysterious guy, but he was born on the island of Réunion, which is it's an island in the off the southern part of Africa, which is French territory, to hippie parents who pretty quickly lost interest in Michel, who was an only child. So he was shipped off to the mainland, France Métropole, as they say, and he lived with his grandparents, who were also relatively eccentric. His grandmother was a militant communist. And then he was sent to boarding school just outside Paris in a town called Meaux. And then he studied, I think, agricultural engineering. And he worked basically as a public servant in the sort of agriculture sector. And then, yeah,
Right.
and while he was a bureaucrat, he began to write poetry and prose. I think he set up a literary journal. So he worked his way to fame in that way.
Infamy,
Infamy is
almost.
probably the better word. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so all these details about his life are starting to make sense now. About, him studying
Mm,
agriculture. I know that he's been very vocal on issues to do with class and proletariat and the working class and the gilets jaunes and farmers. Am I right in thinking maybe it was in the Netherlands, perhaps it was across Europe, there was a bit of an
mm.
uprising of the farmers? Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe that was in the Netherlands relatively recently. I think it was about 6 months ago, where there was some kind of agricultural reform proposed, and it upset the farming, the agricultural community a lot, and sort of mirroring what happened in France in 2018.
Yeah. And what's happening right now in Paris? Like, paint the picture for us there.
Well, right now things are back to normal, but a couple of weeks ago, as I'm sure you saw, we had pretty extraordinary rioting all across the country and totally bizarre atmosphere. It really seemed like the country was descending into civil war.
Wow.
Yeah, it was um, of course set off by this the killing of this young man, Nahel, who was a 17-year-old and was in a car, the police say. We don't, I don't think that all the facts are clear, but he was in a rental car, Mercedes, which he was driving dangerously. He's 17 years old. There was a 14-year-old in the car, and the police tried to stop the vehicle. Niall, I think it seems from the video, tried to evade the police and was then shot by a police officer, and this set off, um, this really extraordinary revolt, quite frightening, frankly, and shocking. Uh,
Okay. And Nahel is or was Maghrebi, right?
that's right.
From
Ye-
North Africa.
That's right. Yeah, he was Moroccan Algerian living in Nanterre, which, as I mentioned, I know the neighborhood because
Yeah, you teach
I
there.
teach there.
Where is Nanterre?
Nanterre is to the west of Paris. It's about 15 minutes
Okay.
on the train from central Paris.
And describe the demographic there. What's it like?
Um, it's not a rich neighborhood. It was traditionally white working class. A lot of the white working class has been replaced by the North African immigrants from the Maghreb. Yeah, so Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. I wouldn't. I never thought of it as a dangerous place to be. Frankly, it's not Yeah, it's not the nicest neighborhood in Paris or in the Parisian suburbs, but a relatively normal Paris suburb, I would say.
Were you surprised when you saw this in the news?
Um, Not surprised that there was a confrontation with the police following this event because, um, well, I guess everyone has to make up their own minds, and the courts will decide about whether the police officer should have done this or whether it was criminal. Um, but I was certainly surprised by the response, which was, I mean, very sudden and very violent and pretty frightening, frankly.
Well, does tie into Welbeck because, as readers of Welbeck will know, he has been highly criticised for his opinions or his writing on the tension between France, white France, France as we know it, and New France with its multiculturalism, in particular migration from those French colonies in North Africa. Um, I've spent a bit of time in France, and you do notice that there is a bit of a tension. How would you paint the picture for people who aren't familiar with France and the culture?
I agree with you. It does feel that there is a bit of more than a well tension, or let's say a kind of there's a different lifestyle. For example, I was in Bordeaux not this weekend, but the previous weekend for a wedding, and it was really striking walking around sort of downtown Bordeaux that there are kind of cafes where North African men, exclusively men, go to drink coffee and smoke shisha, and then all of the rest of the local population there in Bordeaux drinking wine and eating their charcuterie, the cold
Mm-hmm.
meats,
Mm-hmm.
and it really is a kind of there is that separation. You do feel it in Paris, a little bit less so because the nature of Paris is that it's frankly a really expensive place to live. So you have sort of um, poorer neighborhoods and then wealthier neighborhoods, and so it's not as I don't know, it's not as stark as it was when I went to Bordeaux, or maybe it's just a change of scenery. But it did occur to me that there are certain cultural differences which I think it's difficult to imagine how this is sort of reconciled, or how you
Mm-hmm.
get to a situation where you have a monoculture, which, by the way, France is not a multicultural country. They don't subscribe to this idea that we do in Australia and England, I guess, in the US. France is a monoculture. We have our republican values, and if you want to live in France, you have to subscribe to them. So it's a different
Mm-hmm.
conception, and
Very
certainly, yeah,
interesting.
and certainly I don't think they've been successful in that regard. Although, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. The French have not been successful, or the immigrants haven't signed on to, what everyone else has signed on to, which is the Republican values.
And yeah, France is a very secular
Mm,
nation. They've banned, I'm not sure when that came about, but I did a brief exchange at a public school there, and don't wear crucifixes, nor yarmulkes, nor hijab.
sure.
That's so
Yeah.
central to the French culture, and the banning of the burqa and the burkini and
Mm,
all that as well.
yes. Yeah.
But at the same time, I know the tension is that the French colonized North
Mm,
Africa. So I saw that after these riots recently, I heard some people saying, "Well, if you don't like it, go home. If you don't like
mm,
France, go back to where you came from." And those people saying, "Well, we're here because you colonized our country."
mm,
And I think was it the Pieds Noirs,
mm,
the North African men who fought for
mm.
France and died for France, and it's so well, it's a common story, and yeah, that's what Welbeck talks about, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, to a large extent, certainly in submission, he considers the compatibility of Islam with French Republican values. And it's actually really a precept of the book is that they are incompatible. The question is how we resolve this. And the answer is it's an intriguing one. It's a really clever and insightful sort of vision into how this could be resolved. Is that basically the left forms an alliance with the Islamic population, and we have a sort of peaceful resolution between these two communities. But in the end, the Islamist is the dominant group, and everyone has to convert to Islam. And in the end, it's actually good for people like the white male, because once the main character converts, he has a pretty plum job. He can have multiple wives. So it's a bizarre kind of thought experiment, which only Houellebecq could come up with.
So why do you think he's criticised as being Islamophobic and was actually sued, I think, on a few occasions and taken to court for Islamophobia?
Sure. Yeah, he's been taken to court at least twice. Once was in 2001 when he said Islam is the stupidest religion in promoting his book Platform, which also envisions a kind of violent terrorist. Platform is much more violent than Submission.
I've read both, but I'm sort of struggling to... Platform's the one he goes to Thailand as well.
That's
or
right.
The
That's right.
protagonist goes to Thailand,
Yes.
It's a hard read at times.
Yeah.
His books are so... it's another reason why they're controversial, right? They're so vulgar in many ways, not just for the comments on Islam or religion, but sex, which just seems so French. And I wonder if any other country or culture could have produced Houellebecq. I don't think they could have.
I totally agree. He could only be French. Yeah, absolutely. And in the new book, he goes into some pretty unsparing detail about these sexual encounters he was involved in with these Dutch this Dutch art collective, who wanted to make a film starring him.
Yeah, so his new book is Quelques Mois dans ma vie, a few months of my life, and as you write in your piece, he got himself embroiled in this pickle. Maybe that's not the right word, but he sort of signed a contract that he would be in this film where he would have sex with, was it one young fan or multiple young fans?
What happened was he was contacted by the kind of leader of this group, whom he calls the Cockroach, which gives you an idea of his opinion of this Dutch filmmaker concerning something unrelated, just to sort of form a rapport with Houellebecq. And then once he had established a kind of line, a direct line to him, he said, "Oh, I'm coming to Paris and I'm with a nice young lady who'd love to sleep with you." And Houellebecq, being the guy that he is, it's even shocking if you sort of understand the character. He sends his wife to meet the pair, so Stefan, and this woman he calls the Sow. His wife sort of agrees that they would have a threesome. So the Sow, Houellebecq's wife, and Houellebecq. And then the Sow, I feel bad using that term, but let's go with it. She convinces them that she would film it for her OnlyFans account. Houellebecq apparently didn't understand that OnlyFans is a commercial thing. People have it and they make a living from it. He thought it was like this thing for fans and it's exhibitionism, but it's not a commercial thing. Anyway, so it was filmed, and Houellebecq has what he describes as a pretty unsatisfying sexual encounter with the Sow, who apparently showed
harsh birds,
very harsh, who showed no signs of bisexuality, which was very disappointing to him. And then Stefan, so the Cockroach, suggested that he come to the Netherlands, where a whole coterie of young ladies were eager to sleep with him. And despite what had happened in Paris, Houellebecq agreed. He went to Amsterdam, but he signed a contract which he had, they'd negotiated beforehand. And he insisted, this is for a kind of art film. I'm sleeping with these women and you can film certain things, but this is an art film, basically. This isn't a porn film. And he was pretty sure that this clause in the contract that he had insisted was included would prevent any kind of pornographic video emerging, which would obviously be highly embarrassing to him. He didn't realize that he'd also in that contract signed to the Cockroach the rights to diffuse the video that had been filmed in Paris. There was nothing art film, I don't think, about that. It was just like an amateur porn film with himself, his wife, and the sow. So that's how it all started.
You describe him as saying in the book that he suffered so badly from this incident that he ruined his sex drive, which is obviously very strong in him. So that's a big deal. Yes. That he suffered almost from bulimia and all these other horrible conditions. So, but despite that happening to him, you don't have that much sympathy for him, right?
Yeah, it's strange because when I have the book here, when I bought it, I thought, great, another Houellebecq. I love Houellebecq, and this is autobiographical. I know that it concerned two scandals. It's a small book, so I thought, I'm gonna just enjoy this, and I did enjoy it. It's written in his characteristically kind of wry style, and it's very frank. He goes into little tangents about, how much he appreciates amateur pornography, and he manages to sort of integrate literary references, and so it's a great read. That's probably something that doesn't come through in my article is that it's a really enjoyable read. But that said, I did walk away from it thinking, okay, so you're unhappy about being in trouble for inciting racial hatred for words that you yourself said and you have sort of renounced, so admitted were things you probably shouldn't have said or went too far. So you're upset about that, and you're upset about this thing with the Dutch art collective, but you were a sort of willing participant, and you didn't show any, you didn't adequately read the contract or send it to a lawyer. I mean, this is not a guy without resources or advisors. So as much as I'm a fan of Houellebecq, I had, my conclusion was, well, what do you expect? I mean, you very much...
You're victim blaming.
Maybe I am. But it seems that he's the architect of all his own problems. So that was just my honest conclusion. Wasn't one that I particularly wanted to arrive at as a fan, but that was my honest conclusion.
And beyond that, you sort of argue that because he has been so hedonistic,
well, he's also,
that it's come to bite him on the butt.
He's also quite moralistic in some ways. For example, and obviously you can have a different point of view on different issues, but he seems to have almost a kind of Christian ethic on certain issues like abortion and euthanasia. So obviously he's against those practices. He thinks that the 1960s was a disaster for the human race because it set in train this era of libertinism and a loss of morals. But on the other hand,
it's quite ironic.
Yeah, he has these orgies with these young fans, and he's 3 times divorced. I mean, it's not clear, but it seems that he's estranged from his only son, which there's obviously a pattern there in the family. But I just find him, his philosophical beliefs confused. It seems that, and he's very candid about sort of trying to understand his own moral code, and he's very intellectually honest. I just find some of his beliefs hard to reconcile or maybe even totally contradictory, frankly. Yeah.
What's the general opinion uh, in France regarding
Mm.
Houellebecq?
Same as anywhere, to be honest. You have people who, it seems to me that the same proportion of the population who, let's say, reads books like him as anywhere else. So some people, you say the name and they roll their eyes and they say he's that kind of pretentious, you know, classic French, old school, chauvinist
Lech.
kind of guy, exactly. And then you mention the name and someone springs up immediately and they absolutely adore him. So very much the same as elsewhere. It's just that he's a bit better known here.
Yeah. I mean, I know the reason I like him. The first book I read was Soumission. I read it in French, so I probably didn't understand quite as much as I would have understood in English. I'll have to reread it. But I just found it so unlike anything I'd ever read
Yeah.
before. But I liked it because it was like, for example, like Lolita by Nabokov or like even Bret Easton Ellis's books, which absolutely shook me. They were so outrageous and vile at times and vulgar. I love that stuff. I love that in
Yeah.
film, in art, and just the topics he was talking about, these, highly controversial topics regarding France's history
Mm.
and colonialism and religion. I just found it so, titillating.
No, for sure. I mean, he manages to mix pretty unlikely elements. You have the candid sex scenes, then you have philosophy being integrated into all his stories, bits of science fiction, obviously, especially in Submission, speculative fiction, and somehow he makes it all work. But frankly, I think for me, what I enjoy most is just his just his observations of life as a single male, basically trying to get laid. You know, it's
Yeah.
it's it, and that there's so much of himself in these characters, but you're looking at this character who's so abject, so pathetic, and it's hilarious, and I admire that because I think fiction nowadays is so, how would I describe it? Trying to construct sort of perpetrator and victim, and it's the perpetrator is always that guy, and the victim's usually this guy writing the book or the character in the book who
Yeah.
resembles the author. And Welbeck's books, his characters are the victims of his society, but he's not saying feel sorry for me as he does in this book. He's saying, look how absurd, look how ridiculous this character is, look how pathetic this character is. And I think what stands out above all for me is just how funny that is.
And I think especially once you understand that, I'm not sure if he's explicitly said they're based on him, but it's quite obvious that he's in there. And with his appearance and his demeanor, if people haven't seen a photo, he's a very unattractive older man. I'm not sure how old he is now. He'd be in his 70s, late 60s.
He's close.
56. If he's born in 1956, he'd be 65 or
Something like
something,
that.
about my parents' age,
Yeah.
yeah. And he's a chain smoker and his hair's crazy, and yet he was married or is married to like a far younger like Chinese woman, and even that's interesting considering people sort of branding him as a racist, but he's with this Chinese woman. And then he also discusses, at least in Platform, like going to Southeast Asia to participate in sex tourism with Asian women. And yeah, not that he says that he does it, the character does it, but yeah, what a character.
He is. He's got this kind of goblin quality in his older age. He's kind of
Definitely.
hunched over with this
Grotesque.
wisps of hair, and he's not an attractive man nowadays. But surprisingly, if you see photos of him when he was in his 20s and 30s, he was a very handsome young man.
You think?
Well, I'm not such a good judge, to be honest. But I mean,
I've seen some.
when he was really young in his 20s, I saw a photo yesterday of him. I was reading an article about him, and I thought, wow, he was a pretty handsome young guy. I think at a certain point, though, something switched pretty quick.
Okay, so what do you think is like the future of Houellebecq? Does he show any signs of stopping on the Islamophobia front, or do you think he's going to keep criticizing it?
Well, you know, his defense in the book concerning his recent comments was basically to say, look, talking about there's going to be a civil war and there's going to be Bataclans in reverse. That's what he said. So yeah,
Yeah.
it is pretty strong language. He did walk away from that and he said, look, it was a long interview. I actually wanted to edit it, and this is his whole grievance with the guy who interviewed him, who was previously a kind of he's a very well-known philosopher in France. And previously,
What interview is
his
that,
name is
sorry?
Michel Houellebecq, and
Oh, right,
yeah,
yes.
he's very well known in France. He's probably the leading sort of one of the leading public intellectuals. And Houellebecq had previously spoken very highly of him as an admirer. And following this interview, they've had obviously a big falling out because Houellebecq thinks he should have allowed him to correct his words or to have it taken
Yeah.
out or edited out or whatever. Um, but concerning his remarks in that interview, which got him in trouble, he basically said, I went too far. I want to correct the record. So I don't think his views have changed. I think he sort of maybe misspoke or exaggerated a bit. And he'll continue to comment on, you know, the compatibility of Islam and French culture. And frankly, I think that's a good thing. I think he's an interesting voice. There are certainly issues which need to be discussed. So I hope he'll stay. You know, he's a pretty private guy, which is another reason this book is of such interest. But I hope he'll continue to comment in the public domain, and I hope he'll produce more books. I found the last one, the most recent one, Anéantir, to annihilate. It's 720 pages. There's no English version, so it's pretty labored reading in French. Wasn't my favorite read of his at all. So he might be at the end of his career, but who knows? Maybe he'll come back with something just as kind of shocking and prescient as he has been in the past.
I hope so. And I hope he starts feeling a little bit better and gets his sex drive back. Or maybe he should,
Give it a rest.
yeah, maybe it's better. The world's better without it. Yeah. Okay. And perhaps before we go, would you like to talk about your writing? You've written this trilogy. It seems pretty interesting. I haven't read any of them yet, unfortunately, but I plan to.
Sure. So I've written, first of all, for you guys a number of times, and I'm grateful that you've given me a platform to talk about things that interest me. But concerning these books, yeah, I wrote 3 books. I don't know where it came from. I never had any idea of being a writer, but maybe Paris does that to a person. So I wrote these 3 books, which I self-published. One is set in Sydney, where I'm from, and I know where you guys are based. One is set in Rio, in Brazil, where I lived for about 8 months. And one is set in Paris, where I live now. And I don't think they're super influenced, maybe partially influenced by Houellebecq, but they're sort of psychological novels about the psychological effects of a city have on a person who doesn't have enough to keep him distracted.
Is it a young male protagonist
Yeah,
as well?
yeah, in every case, yes.
First person?
Just a coincidence, of course.
Interesting. Okay, and do you have any other essays that are in the works for Quillette? Anything else you'd like to write about? You've written a lot about France, obviously, about French politics and also about Comte, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Comte, yeah.
Comte.
Comte, yeah.
Oops.
Who's
I'm thinking of the cheese.
yeah, the Comte. But yeah, that was the first one. And actually, Houellebecq is a big fan of Comte, and I actually sent him. I found his email address, Michel Houellebecq, and I actually sent him. I
Wow.
sent him an email saying, I published this thing on Auguste Comte, who I know is a big influence on you, and discussing other things, common interests, asking him if he likes certain writers, and he wrote back a fairly lengthy reply.
How nice.
And he said he wouldn't read the essay because it's in English and it's too much effort. But otherwise, he gave me a few insights into his influences. We talked a bit. He talked a bit about science fiction because I had mentioned a few books. So that's
Is he a fan of science
big
fiction?
fan. Yeah, big fan.
Interesting.
So that was
I've never really thought about science fiction outside of the English language, but I assume I know there are some
Yeah, he's a big
Spanish
fan of English-speaking science fiction, especially kind of weird fiction like H.P. Lovecraft. His first book was a book.
Yes, I did know about that. Yeah.
So that's a big influence on him, and you can see that influence especially in the possibility of an island, which is set 2,000 years in the future. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Okay. And you've also written about, Celine. Okay, so you're in the right country, obviously. Do you think you'll stay there? You'll stay
I've
in France?
actually just put an offer on a flat, so I guess I'm staying here for a bit.
Amazing. Lucky
Yeah.
you.
So,
Okay.
but I
Well,
hope.
I'm proud that you came from Sydney.
Well, I love Sydney. Great. It's a unique place, and I'm looking forward to visiting at the end of the year.
Yeah. I'm actually visiting Paris at the end of the year too. Hopefully we don't, hopefully we can, cross paths.
Sure.
Not be in the opposite
Sure.
hemispheres. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, it was lovely talking to
You too.
you, and thanks so much for your contributions to Quillette. And hopefully we see you published again soon.
Yeah, look forward to it. Thanks so much, Zoe.